This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, so Bob Tuori is the owner and operator of Nook and Cranny Farm in Brooktondale, New York. Nook and Cranny is a 4-acre diversified, intensive organic vegetable farm that serves an 85-member CSA and attends 3 weekly farmers market in the Ithaca area. Bob earned his PhD in plant path. And in addition to farming, Bob is a high school teacher teaching chemistry and sustainable ag. So I welcome you, Bob. Thanks for joining us and look forward to this session on strategies for small farms.
Spare the intro slide because I think Brian did a nice job in telling you a little bit about what we do here. It's a pretty tight place and we grow very intensively, and that really dictates a lot of the management practices that we use here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some soil management practices and tools that we use on the farm, and then more specifically about a SARE-funded farmer SARE grant for researching reduced tillage and tarping with potato growth. So I'll get into first here some management techniques. So we're trying to reduce tillage increasingly, and our primary tillage tool is, we just use BCS tractors, a bunch of implements, but primary tillage we use tiller attachments. So I have a couple tillers, one that's just tiller without the depth control, and then on the right is the picture of a different tiller attachment that has called precision depth roller. So that allows you to carefully set how deep the tines go, and we can pretty carefully reduce how much we disturb soil. So the tiller alone I tend to use in the beginning of the season, and especially for incorporating mowed down cover crops, and it's much better when the soil is potentially wet. Come about June, we're pretty much recycling beds. So at that point, and it's drier, with the precision depth roller, it works much better. We can really more carefully reduce how much tillage happens. So they use that from about June on throughout the season. So here's another really important tool on our very small scale. And we use a weed whacker a tremendous amount. It might seem kind of ridiculous to say this is a soil management tool, but using the weed whacker allows us to not do anything to disturb the soil. So we use it, well, when we're working on particular beds, they're 75, 100 foot long, 3 foot wide, to get rid of cover crop if we want to just work on a particular single bed, and then also throughout the season to reduce weeds and get rid of plant debris. But we can cut the cover crop or the weeds all the way down to the soil surface so that we almost don't have to do another pass with a tiller before we plant into the bed again. And at the end of the season, before we cover crop, we don't really till beds at that point much at all. We just blaze them with either the weed whacker or a flail mower and then broadcast cover crop seed. So we do on larger swaths and with mature cover crop use a flail mower attachment for the BCS, and it works really great. But it's a little bit difficult to work on our tight scale here at this farm. So here are some soil management practices that we really focus on throughout the season. The great majority of our beds are covered throughout the growing season, either with, well, pretty much every single thing we transplant is mulched either with hay or with landscape fabric. And then in addition to that, we also hay all of the pathways at least once. So we have 3 foot beds and there's a 1 foot pathway, that 1/4 of the farm is getting mulched with hay each season. And it really prevents weeds from growing in the pathway, which is like a very obvious benefit, but overall it's adding to our organic matter and allows some resiliency in dry summer for sure. So at the end of the season, come about mid-August, all the way into November. We're really focusing on expiring the growing crop in the bed and keeping it covered, and hopefully with a living cover. So in the beginning of that process in August and through September, we're broadcasting winter rye with the field feed mix. You can see on the left. And we're pretty much doing individual beds at a time whenever the crop is finally harvested. By about October, it's not as practical anymore to be seeding pea, so we're just using winter rye. But we often, depending on the location of the bed or how dry it seems to be at that time, we also put down some hay on top of the rye seed. And then by the end of October and through November, as beds are expired, we don't cover crop anymore because it's a bit too late, but we just cover with hay. This is a particular issue that I think is pretty important whenever you're growing in high tunnel. I guess everyone probably realizes that, but if they're covered for years, the increase in salt on the surface of hoop house soil can be it can be visible. It can be, and it like reduces how well things grow. So there are a couple things we do to try to mitigate salinity in soil. This hoop house on the left is posts are driven in the ground. So we take the plastic off every 3 to 4 years and leave it off for a whole season. And that allows rainwater to wash some of the salt out of there. 2 of our other hoop houses are modular and essentially mobile. So we take them down every season and move them, and they're our primary tomato pepper hoop houses. It allows us to keep a good rotation, but also to have fresh ground to grow the tomatoes in each year. And then also in all the hoop houses throughout the season, and try to preferentially use rainwater. And it seems like it'd be hard to actually catch enough. We have 6 hoop houses, but in this past year, it was no problem. So I have a bunch of these 300-gallon food grade water catchment containers set up around our barn and our house. And with a good 1/4 inch rainstorm to 1/2 inch at most, I can fill these things with 300 gallons of rainwater and have 600 or 900 gallons of rainwater pump out into the hoop house. So it's plumbed right into the irrigation line, goes out to the hoop house. Depending on the season, we can either do overhead water or we set up drip lines in all the hoop houses too. So it's keeping rainwater as opposed to well water going into the hoop house for watering. Next couple slides are a few uses of tarps that we've been working into using tarps in the past few years and seeing their benefits and trying to find useful applications for them. So one thing we did this past year was we had a field off-site that we had cover crop the year before, so we tarped it. It had rye growing pretty abundantly throughout May. We tarped it at the end of May, left the tarp on. It was a black tarp. The picture here doesn't actually show the tarp. Left it on for 2.5 weeks, and that did a really good job of terminating that rye, as you can see in this picture. And then strip tilled some swaths into it, and then planted winter squash, and had the winter squash all planted into landscape fabric, and all the sandbags were right there. So it was a particularly effective use of tarping. We had sandbags there because we had a potato experiment I'll tell you about in a few minutes. And then here is another application of tarps that I'm particularly excited about how well it seems to have worked. So hoop houses all have greens in the fall. Greens are done being harvested November into December. And as soon as we're done harvesting, then we may go in with weed whacker and just blaze it down a little bit, but then put a tarp down over it and leave the tarp out over the winter. And that maintains some moisture in that soil that otherwise these hoop houses can be really deadly dry come March and April when we want to plant them again. So this past year, I tried, we solarized it with clear plastic from November until it was like the end of February. And then we put on, no, I'm sorry, it was the end of January. In the beginning of February, we put a black plastic over it and then let that on for 4 to 5 weeks. And I just took off both the black and the clear plastic this past weekend. And then we planted that entire hoop house with carrots. And it was like the perfect moisture level in there. It's really great. And there really weren't many weeds at all. Some didn't look like much germinated over the winter, but it seems to do a very good job of taking care of the chickweed that's always a problem in hoop houses. So the last part of my talk is I'm just going to tell you about this SARE-funded research project that Ryan and I worked on this past year. So we grow potatoes to serve our CSA pretty substantial amount. We can't really fit it onto our main farm property with any reasonable rotation. And it doesn't have, it doesn't require the real high-end soils that we have here in careful cultivation and management. So we tend to grow them on off-site fallow fields that we rent. And this picture shows generally what these fields look like when we start working with them. I rent some land to do this, typically a lot of perennial. So I've been doing this for several years, and we use a combination of mow it, strip till, plant potatoes, heavy mulching. And then we wanted to try to do some tarps into this to really up our game with reed suppression, and then also carefully track yield and how much labor we use, looking at both tarps and mulches in conjunction with each other. So this is the essence of our experiment. We were looking to see if tarps or mulch or a combination of the two would work out the best for our market scale potato growing operations. This again was their funded research. Okay, here is a field layout for our potato tarp mulch experiment. The 1/4 acre, 60 by 200 feet. We started planting this in the fall of 2020. We mowed it down to the ground, actually twice, and then broadcast 0 rye seed pretty thick, and also put down 50 bales of hay over the top of the cover crop seed. Left it over the winter. It was growing nicely in the spring. And then this field, we divided into 3 different plots. So one part would just be tarped. 1/3 of it would just be mulched. And then the center would be both tarp and mulch, and hay mulch. So in the beginning of May, we went in and put rotary plow furrows. I'll show you pictures of all this in a moment. And the potatoes would be planted into the rotary plow furrows and put a tarp down in 2 of the plots. So left this for 4 weeks, and then a month later took the tarp off. And in the mulch only plot, we had to mow down the mature cover crop, put rotary plow furrows in, and then planted the entire place with potatoes. Another month after that, came back, cultivated, tilled, and then mulched 2/3 of the entire area. And we didn't really do much of anything. It's pretty low management all season until we started harvesting in September. So here's some pictures of field work and some machinery used in this. So this is in the beginning of May. Cover crops going nicely. We used the DCS tractor with a rotary plow in the back, which is like a blender blade, and it throws soil up in one direction. You can go 6 inches deep or so on a big rock with this thing. So we put it right into the cover crop field, and then put a tarp down over it and used a tremendous amount of sandbags. On the left side, you see 1/3 of this field had not been tarped. This we let the rye grow for the whole month, and by the end of June, that rye had gone to maturity. It was stocky, gone to forming seed heads. And so I mowed this down with a flail mower, did a great job of pulverizing that rye into the ground, and then put rotary plow furrows same day, or it was actually the next morning, that's why I put a little bit brown here. Put the rotary plow furrows into that 1/3 of the field. And then on that same day, here's a close-up of what the rotary plow furrow looks like. It just throws soil up to one side, but it was perfect moisture at that point. It rained all May. And then that same day, we took off the tarp. So this picture shows clear difference between, on the right, the 2/3 of the field that had been tarped, and the tarp did a really good job terminating the rye. On the left, this is the rye that had just been mowed a day or so earlier. And then this little swath of green in the center was the rye that couldn't be reached by the mower because the plastic tarp was right next to it. So here we have now 9 furrows, and we planted potatoes into them on the same day. Dropped them, put in half the cart, covered with hose, and then left it for nearly a month. So this is towards the end of June. We did the first of 2 weed assessments. And here we just wanted to really see how the tarp affected the termination of rye and also germination of some weeds. So summary of these results here. Here's the 3 plots. We looked for the percent that was rye covered and the percent that was covered with weeds, which is anything other than rye or potatoes. So the tarp did a great job of getting rid of the rye, but the rye was prevalent, was abundant in the mulched only plot, which hadn't even been mulched yet. And then there were lots of small weeds coming up throughout the whole field. So then, end of June, we used the BCS tiller with the precision depth roller to cultivate lightly, just a couple inches into the soil in the interzone planting area. So we went through and got rid of a lot of small weeds. The tiller blades just scraped a couple inches and loosened up the soil. That loosened up soil was then helpful to form the hill. We used hose to hill up all the potatoes and then mulched 2/3 of the plot. And it was mulched fairly thick, so it was like 6 inches of hay. And then it was pretty much on its own until we started to harvest. So here's the picture midsummer in mulch only plot. It had not been tarped. There's a significant amount of rye coming in, but it doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. The tarp only plot has bare ground exposed, which is not something that we would ever generally do. You can see a fine mat of small weeds coming in, and the best definitely looks to be the tarp plus mulch. So then we left a couple more months, and we started the harvest at the end of September. And here's some pictures of the same 3 plots in the end of September, and it's the situation with weeds seems a bit more dire for sure. We assessed weeds at this point. In the tarp only plot, the weeds were really extreme. Sometimes shading out the canopy of the potatoes. At this point, the potatoes were all finessing. So ultimately, it may not have been that big of a deal, although it made harvesting a bit more difficult. So we harvested potatoes. It went on for a couple of weeks, and then we sorted them, well, cleaned first, and then sorted them to get rid of those that were green or maybe chewed by voles. And then we did well, there was a second weed assessment here, right, too, before we started harvesting. So summary of the weed count here. Again, in the mulch only plot, there's some rye. I don't know how big of a deal that was. I think in a dry year, it may have been more of a problem. But this is pretty remarkable. The weed coverage in the tarp only, in the mulch only, was pretty high, substantially higher than the tarp mulch combination. But the amount by which it increased, it was double in the tarp only and triple in the mulch only. It's pretty amazing amount of weeds. So we feel pretty confident about the combination of tarp and mulch together being the best for weed suppression throughout the whole season. Okay, so here's a summary of our yield assessment. So we had three different treatments: tarp only, mulch only, tarp plus mulch. And then I think I didn't mention this earlier, but each plot had 3 different varieties. We were a little bit concerned to see how the time at which the potatoes matured and finessed might affect their yield, given the huge potential for weeds to take over the field. So we had Pontiac Red as an early variety, which looking at these results, it it really seemed to indicate that that potato season was not great. And we actually grew this variety in a different field as well, and it did equally as poorly. So the two other varieties, the mid-season Cupid Gold and the late-season Red Maria, both seem to yield pretty well. The Cupid Gold responded the best to the tarp plus mulch, increased the most with a combination of those two soil management practices. And the Red Maria was all around probably the best yield potato in this. But both of these did best in the tarp plus mulch. And so why this happened? We think there were two things. There's obviously the weed suppression that seems to be best throughout the whole season in tarp plus mulch. But also we found that the nitrate, the level of soil nitrate was higher when in the tarp area. So this has been shown in other research, and we wanted to see how it played out in the potato experiment. So we checked nitrate levels in soils before we put the tarp down in early May, and then in June when the tarp came off. So 4 parts per million, before we put the tarp down, it went up just a little bit. The soil warmed up. There's probably some more microbial action happening in there. But this is like the non-tarp ground or plot, and the two plots that were tarp increased maybe almost fourfold. So it was a pretty substantial increase in nitrate in the two plots that were tarp. So we think the yield was primarily due to the nitrate and also the suppression of weeds. I don't have data to show on this, but we had temperature sensors in the ground. We did find that both the min and the max temp of the soil increased throughout the tarping period, and so that probably assisted with microbial action in the soil, and also the tarp probably killed that rye pretty quickly to reduce nitrogen tie-up due to the cover crop. So our answer to this question was, well, should we tarp or mulch or do both? And we think, yes, do both, because in a dry year, the mulch would clearly help with moisture retention. The tarp seemed to help with increasing nitrates, leading to a greater yield. And then both of them in conjunction seem to do really good at suppressing weeds and also to terminate cover crop. So that is all that I have to show you today. And Ryan, are we taking questions?
Yeah, we do have time for questions, Bob. Thank you. Any preferred vendors for tarps, Bob? How have you sourced your tarps?
I got tarp at CNY Farm Supply. I think it was in Cortland, right? You suggested. Did I give the name of that correctly?
Yes. CNY Farm Supply. We're based in Ithaca, and you're outside of Ithaca. So we lean towards a place where we could find them locally through an ag supplier, ask around.
Yeah.
You can go pick them up on your own.
They were salvage tarps, right? So like probably any place that sells dairy supplies might have them. Certainly seems easier than getting it shipped. So it wasn't that hard to pick up. To transport, they were, I think, $250 for a 32 by 100 foot tarp.
Bob, I wonder if you could talk about the specifics of the weeds in that field, being a new field, a lot of perennials and.
Yeah, it was pretty evident even the day we took the tarp off that it's mostly perennials. There's a lot of goldenrod, there's some milkweed, there's some bramble, rubus. There was a few other unusual, there was some vetch, but mostly perennial things. And even the day we took the tarp off, the furrows that had been made a month earlier had little goldenrod coming up in them, seemingly actively growing, which is surprising. They hadn't seen any sun in 4 weeks. So those things were not that much of a problem at the beginning of the season. And towards the end, they got fairly large and they were covering parts of the potatoes. So they're there in these fields. I don't know that annual weeds were much of any problem at all. And certainly, I think that combined with mulching, it didn't seem too much of a problem. But we don't really weed the place. We're just growing potatoes on a pretty low maintenance style and get what we can get out of it.
One question from Steve is, what do you use for the mulch? How do you, it sounds like you source quite a bit of it, Bob, so.
Well, I get mulch hay, mulch quality hay from some local guys where I live outside of Ithaca. So I have a list of several who often just call me when they get some hay that gets rained on and they want to get rid of a couple hundred bales of hay. And I don't have a great way to store a couple hundred bales of hay. We probably go through nearing 1,000 over the course of the season, but they'll come by and drop off 50 or 100 at a time, and we use it for a couple weeks or a month. And I don't generally spend that much money on it. It doesn't seem that prohibitive. $3 a bale at most, depending on the quantities that I buy, and they deliver it. We don't haul that hay ourselves. So there's always the issue of weeds coming in with hay, but it hasn't seemed to be that much of a problem.
That was my next follow-up question.
Yeah.
Ken asks, did your treatments have any impact on insect pests?
Well, surprisingly, we didn't. I went over there and scouted probably weekly. I don't think I saw any potato weeds there, and not in the same exact spot, but we grew potatoes nearby in the same field the year prior to that. So I didn't see any potato beetles. We had no issue to go in there and hygienic for potato beetles. So nothing that I could see. It's possible. I think mulching probably has some benefit with potato beetle population, but I don't have any data for that.
I know you tried to look at voles because that was an issue in other farms, the use of mulch and voles. What did you find there?
Well, there was a percentage of potatoes that were mulch used. It was not surprising. In past years, I don't think we've certainly never quantitated that well, but I think it was something like 5 to 7% of the potato harvest was voltude, and it was a little bit higher in the the mulch only plot. Sorry, it was a little bit higher in the mulch only plot. I don't know if that was just because of the mulch on the surface. I tend to think that the reason why the vole action was a bit more in the mulch only plot was because it was close to a fallow part of the field where it hadn't been mowed. 20 feet away, there were grasses and goldenrod that were up to your shoulder by the end of the summer. So there was just probably a greater population of voles on that edge of the field. I don't know if it was that big of a difference, 5 to 7 to at most 8 or 9% voltude, and we were being pretty generous about what we call voltude. So I don't think it was too much of a problem. I will say though, so I mentioned I took the tarp off the hoop house past weekend, and as we were rolling up the tarp, we found there were numerous voles in there, and lots of little vole nests with all the bits of debris and hay, and then when we got the plastic out of there, they took off out the side, and I don't know why they would want to come back in, because now it's just bare ground with carrot seed planted, and I've done this a bunch of years, and I don't think they're going to go back into that particular hoop house. Now they're out in the field somewhere, so it wasn't too much of a problem with the potato field, though.
We've got a couple other questions here and just a couple more minutes. Was there a difference in labor required between your treatments?
Yeah, so I didn't show that data because it gets a little bit, it's a bit much, you know, and I wanted to keep it simple, but we carefully kept track of all the time that we spent every time we went to work on the potato field. And we also tallied it according to the different treatments. So the plots that were tarp had a pretty large amount of labor investment. Mulching, I don't think is that tremendous amount of, I mean, I don't think you were over there more than a couple of hours with a handful of people to mulch that whole place and hill it that day too. So tarping though is a substantial labor investment. And it was the first time we had tarped on that large of a scale. So we were particularly concerned about doing it well on a rented field that was next to like a pretty major road, and I could not risk having that tarp come off. So we used probably way too many sandbags, but it was a lot of effort. So at any rate, we tallied all the hours of labor and divided it up into 3 different plots. And then for me, it seemed the most interesting was to make a ratio of the pounds of marketable potatoes per labor hour investment, and we were getting something like 17 pounds per hour out of the tarp plus mulch plot, and also in the mulch only plot. So the yield in the mulch only plot was a bunch lower, but it also took less labor hours, so it seemed to work out about even. But I will honestly say though, I think that we could probably do that tarping in half the amount of time that we did the first time in that experiment. And we did, since then we've moved multiple tarps, and we're just way more efficient at it. We know how to do it better. So it's a labor investment, and like everything, you got to practice a bit before you feel really comfortable doing it.
Great. I do want to honor the time. We're about at time to switch over to Natalie. Bob, there is a question in there from Deborah about other soils data that you collected. Maybe you could pop some of that, some of your soils results, or at least what you measured in the chat to answer that question as we switch over to Natalie. Right.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I love following all these excellent speakers because there's so much information that now I don't need to cover. I know it is kind of the low energy part of the day though, so I will try to keep it moving. So shameless plug, I'm surprised Ryan didn't actually do this already, but Ryan and I, along with a couple of colleagues at the University of Maine, just published a tarping guide to the Northeast, and it was a real labor of love. I would encourage you to check it out. You can get it at just Google it. You can find it at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. So the problem with tillage as a primary weed management strategy, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just always like to remind people that tillage is okay in small doses, but in large doses, it can lead to some very big soil health problems, including poor aggregation, crusting, and erosion. And increasingly, as John Paul and a lot of folks alluded to, this is just not a good situation in the face of climate change when we really need that water holding capacity. You never know when you're going to have a major rain event, etc. But managing weeds with less tillage is a real issue. So in order to do that, I think it's really important that we be thinking about the weed life cycle. So this is an illustration that is in the tarping guide if you want to check it out in more detail. So the weed life cycle for annual weeds, you have to have this seed bank in the soil, and in any given year, if there's the right conditions, some seeds will germinate, and then if you don't take care of them, they will grow and they will reproduce and they will add more seeds to your seed bank. So a lot of weed management is seedling stage management. That includes tillage, herbicides, and hand weeding. Tillage and herbicides being kind of the big hammers. Now, seed bank stage management involves preventing germination and reducing the size of the seed bank. And I would argue that if we're reducing tillage, we really need to think about alternative weed management strategies that are not focused on that seedling stage management. And again, John Paul had the story of the no-till experiment that was just a ton of hand weeding, which is not sustainable economically. So small scale farmers have come up with their own low and no-till strategies for managing weeds. In 2014, the Market Gardener was published, and this was kind of the start of the tarp frenzy, I would say. So tarping, or occultation as it's known. And that wasn't really a no-till, but kind of a reduced tillage strategies. But since then, we've had this proliferation of books that farmers have published, case studies on organic no-till farming. And a lot of these case studies, a lot of these farmers rely on heavy compost or other sources of mulch and tarps. So where do these strategies target the weed life cycle? Well, tarps kill existing weeds by stopping photosynthesis. I know that's really obvious, but it's important to think about that, think about the mechanism of what's happening. And then they also may encourage fatal germination of weed seeds. We're actually not really sure what's happening under the tarps. There's certainly some germination of seed that's happening, but we don't know if it's really depleting the seed bank. Deep mulch keeps weed seeds from getting the germination cues that they need. So it essentially just buries the weed seed bank. So it is a seed bank management strategy. And it's effective, but compost-based systems are kind of problematic, I think, because there's a limited supply of compost. It can lead to excess nutrients, especially phosphorus. It's expensive. And then this emerging concern, I'm from Maine. I don't know if you all in New York are starting to deal with this, but this emerging concern of PFAS in various sources of manure, not just sludge, manure, hay, etc. So bringing external inputs onto your farm can be problematic for contaminants. So can cover crops be a mulch grown in place? And I mean, I think this is not a new concept. As John Paul and Sarah talked about, this cover crop based organic rotational no-till has been around now for quite a while, and they've been refining it for field crops research using this roller crimper. But the roller crimper and this scale doesn't really work for small scale farms. So what about cover crops and tarps? The pros of this system include it's easily accessible equipment. A lot of small farmers have these tarps. Roller crimper is not required. There's multiple weed suppression tactics. So instead of just a cover crop mulch, you also have a tarp, which is kind of a big hammer. There are also other benefits of the system, including moisture conservation and nitrogen dynamics. Bob mentioned how these tarps retain nitrate in the soil by preventing leaching. And also if you're using a legume cover crop, you're fixing quite a bit of nitrogen and contributing that to your system. The cons of this system, these tarps are plastic. We could talk about that for a long time. I won't. I'll just acknowledge that it is unfortunate that they are plastic. There's also opportunity costs associated with this system. So the cover crop production period can take away from your cash crop production period, and the tarping period can also take away from your cash crop production period. So you or farmers have to quantify what that opportunity costs to their individual system. And then there's this question of, does this system bring new weed management challenges like perennial weeds, or is it selecting for species that are resistant to tarping? So we started doing research on this back in 2015, which feels like ages ago now. We did a couple of proof of concept experiments back when it really felt like we needed proof of concept. Now it feels like everybody's doing this, but back then it did feel relatively new and unproven. So we did these experiments. We applied tarps in early June in Maine and New Hampshire, which I think is probably a little bit cooler, delayed climate compared to most of you in New York. We transplanted cabbage. It was a short season cabbage variety from Johnny's called Tiara, first week of July. And then we harvested cabbage in late August. And like I said, we did 2 separate experiments. And I'm not going to go over the research results. I will just say that this system works for cabbage, which is fantastic. We published two articles on that, and you can access those. But it raised a lot of questions about whether we can improve it. Like, it works, but we think we can do it better. So one of the things we wanted to dig into is this question of opportunity costs. So I calculated from one of those experiments, what were the cumulative degree days that were used for each period of our production system, and found, so the spring cover crop growth, and this is base 4, which is, a little low, but I think that's appropriate for cabbage and it's appropriate for cover crops. We're using, between 400 and 500 degree days for the spring cover crop growth. But then when we tarped for 4 weeks, almost a month, we were using just about as many degree days for that tarping period. And then the cabbage itself was using about twice that. So if you combine the spring cover crop growth and the tarping period, you could probably produce a cabbage crop. And is it worth it? What is the best use of your growing degree days? So that led us to another experiment. And we had this question: how can we minimize the opportunity costs and maximize the benefits? So we thought, let's tinker with our termination date and our tarp duration. Like, there's no reason why we need to tarp for 4 weeks. Maybe we can really tighten that up and see if we can increase the benefits. So we did this experiment. This is an aerial of our field site in New Hampshire. We seeded our cover crops rye vetch mixture in mid-September, which is a little bit later than ideal. As John Paul mentioned, it'd be great if we could get that in by the beginning of September, but we also wanted to do something that felt realistic for what farmers can actually do, and pushing it towards the beginning of September, it just feels like a lot of crops aren't out of the ground yet. So we wanted to do something realistic. We seeded it mid-September. And then in the spring, we had 3 termination dates 10 days apart. In New Hampshire, those dates were May 22nd, June 1st, and June 12th. And then we had different termination methods. We had glyphosate, a 10-day tarp treatment, a 20-day tarp, 30-day tarp, and at UNH, we also had a roll crimp treatment. So what that looked like, that red box there is a block in our experiment. So that has all of the treatments. You can see that it's in the middle there is that first termination date. So that the cover crops there were all terminated on May 22nd. Then T2, you can see there's still 1 tarp on that. You can also see the green plot there is the roll crimp, because we did have cover crop regrowth. The plot that still has the tarp is the 30-day tarp treatment. And then those other 3, that's the glyphosate, 10-day tarp, and 20-day tarp. So that's kind of what it looked like. And you might ask, well, why? That's still pretty late. Why not the earliest possible termination dates? And the answer is just that if we terminated it a whole lot earlier, it wouldn't really be mulch. This is a picture from May 7th. And as you all know, cover crops really start to grow exponentially in spring. And if you terminate them before that, there's just not a lot of mulch. Again, that's what it looks like, several weeks later. And so this production system just is not for your earliest season crops. Not all production systems are going to fit all crops. We were interested in looking at different ecosystem services or benefits, including cover crop biomass quantity and quality, cover crop nitrogen, the decomposition and mulch remaining, nitrogen mineralization, and the weed biomass and community composition. I am showing you this now because this is how, after going through some of the information, I'm going to go through kind of a visualizing these trade-offs with spider plots. And so I'm going to introduce it now so it can settle in, and then we'll come back to it. So spider plots are a way, like I said, of visualizing trade-offs. And so we've got at the top here, cover crop biomass, weed suppression is the W, M is the mulch, IN is inorganic nitrogen at planting date, and N is the total cover crop nitrogen. So farther out on the circle is better. So the greatest weed suppression is the farthest out. Same with all of their variables. So in this particular example, we have good weed suppression, but we don't have much inorganic nitrogen. And these are all relativized for the in comparison to the best treatment. So cover crop biomass, effects of termination date. I know this is a lot of pictures, but on the top we've got our site from Maine, and moving from left to right, we have later and later termination dates, and you can see that there's increasing cover crop biomass. You can also see that there's increasing purple, there's increasing vetch in that cover crop biomass. Same on the bottom in New Hampshire. And I also wanted to show this because this is the tool that we use in Maine. So in New Hampshire, we had a roller crimper. In Maine, I did this at my family's farm. We did not have a roller crimper, but we had an awesome John Deere riding tractor and lawn roller, which you can get for about $150. You just fill it with water. So that does a really nice job of laying that cover crop down flat. In terms of nitrogen, again, increasing nitrogen as you get later, even 10, 20 days, makes a huge difference in the amount of nitrogen that is fixed by vetch. So at this point, rye has captured, accumulated all of the nitrogen that it will, but vetch is continuing to fix nitrogen. And so there's a pretty big difference between that first termination date and the last termination date at both our Maine and New Hampshire sites. And I don't know, like Ryan, if you want to, I'm not checking the chat. If you want to stop me at any point with a question, feel free to stop me mid talk. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
Yeah, I'm monitoring the chat, so we're good to go right now, and then we'll
okay.
We'll answer later.
So
Thanks.
Nitrogen mineralization. It was great that Bob mentioned this. This has been observed in multiple studies that tarps prevent nitrate from leaching, which is great. So we found that for this first termination date, there was increasing net nitrogen mineralization with a longer tarp duration, which is not surprising. It's nice when you get the results that you expect. Moving later to the second and third termination dates, very similar pattern, but just an increase in the actual quantities that we observed. So tarps prevent nitrate from leaching. Longer tarp duration allows for more nitrogen mineralization, and delayed cover crop termination leads to higher nitrogen levels, inorganic nitrogen. And that could be because there's just warmer conditions, it's later in the season. And it could also be because there's greater cover crop nitrogen going into that system. It's likely a combination of both. Cover crop biomass, mulch, and weed suppression. So here you can see what that mulch looks like. On the left, that's me harvesting the mulch and the weeds. And then on the right, you can see I put a square around that little patch of weeds to show that that's where I had harvested mulch previously, and just to show that mulch really does make a difference in weeds being able to germinate and grow. One thing that we did find is that some perennial weeds are less susceptible to tarping and cover crops. So the whole part of the weed cycle that I left off in the beginning is the perennial weed cycle. And anybody who's moving towards more no-till will find that you get to learn a lot more about perennial weeds. And so there's in addition to the seed bank, there's also the bud bank, which is the perennial, it can be rhizomes, it can be nutlets. In this case, this is nutgrass, which is one of the weeds that we have found is particularly resistant to tarping. So if you have a yellow nutgrass problem, tarping may not be the answer for you. So getting back to this visualizing trade-offs with the spider plots. This experimental design resulted in sort of 5 different planting dates. I'm only presenting the data from New Hampshire. So the first planting date, June 1st, and then the last planting date, July 12th. So here comes a lot of information. Boom. I wish I could see your faces. I can't. But what strikes you? So what strikes me, I've spent a lot of time with these data, so I probably see them very differently than you do. But what strikes me initially is, oh, wow, that 10-day tarp on May 22nd, that is a small area. You're not getting a lot of ecosystem services. Then what else strikes me? Oh, but that 30-day tarp that was terminated on June 12th, that's a big area. You're getting a lot of ecosystem services. And then the final thing that strikes me is roller crimping stinks. You just don't get, in this case, it stinks because we didn't get complete termination of our cover crop, which, maybe if it had been if we had delayed things more, we would have. But yeah, in our climate, we just don't get the weed suppression and the efficacy of termination that we need to make that system work. So I'm going to go through these by planting date, but I'm not going to do every single planting date. I'm just going to do June 1st, June 21st, and July 12th, so we can digest this a little better from the perspective of, given a planting date, what is the best thing to do? So if you are dead set on planting by June 1st, you absolutely have to get your crops in the ground by June 1st. And you're organic, you're not going to use glyphosate, okay. You could do the roller crimp. It's very ineffective at weed suppression. Or you could use 10-day tarp. You get the earliest planting date, but you're not really maximizing any ecosystem services. So this system can work, but you're probably going to end up doing quite a bit of hand weeding, as John Paul mentioned happened with their roller crimping experiment. But then if you move to June 21st, if you can delay your crop planting, and here we get the benefit of being able to look at a 10-day tarp duration, a 20-day tarp duration, and a 30-day tarp duration. And so we can look across those, but these are all ending up as a planting date of June 12th. And we can see that at this point, weed suppression is optimized for all treatments. But a longer tarp duration, so this 30-day tarp terminated on May 22nd, does result in greater inorganic nitrogen at the planting date. But delayed cover crop termination leads to greater cover crop biomass, total nitrogen, and mulch. So the question is, what is most valuable to you? If you really want to get your crop in the ground on June 21st, is it more valuable for you to have a little bit more inorganic nitrogen? Do you actually prefer not to have quite as much mulch? Then maybe you could do a 30-day tarp and terminate it earlier. But if you want more mulch, if you want more biomass, you want more total nitrogen, then delaying termination is probably better. And then finally, if you're willing to wait until July 12th to plant your crop, you get a ton of ecosystem services. You maximize all ecosystem services, but your planting date is really delayed. So again, it just comes back to this question of what is most valuable to you. These are trade-offs. There's no perfect system, and what works for you. So conclusions, cover crop based no-till with tarps works. It's especially good for fall brassicas. This is a picture from Evening Song Farm in Vermont, and they are one of the case studies featured in our tarping guide. And they've adopted this for their fall brassicas. They've even been tinkering with a planting tool to make transplanting a little bit easier. And they found that this has really become an integral part of their cropping system for those fall brassicas. Most ecosystem services are maximized by delaying cover crop termination. And that's especially true when hairy vetch is included. It has delayed maturity compared to rye. I don't know a lot about Austrian winter pea. I would be curious to know if that's similar for Austrian winter pea, or if you can get those, get that nitrogen earlier. I tend to think that Austrian winter pea just doesn't fix quite as much nitrogen, period. The exception to that is inorganic nitrogen at planting date is increased with longer tarp duration. So if that's your primary goal, then tarping for a longer period may be better. So future work can experiment with different cover cropping and cropping sequences, possibly even shorter tarp durations, like a couple days in summer. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but just the difference between when we started this in 2015 and it felt like we actually applied for, we got a research for novel approaches grant from Northeast SARE. And now when I think about this, this is not a novel approach at all anymore. No one would say this is novel because people are doing it. So we've come a long way, and I think that's pretty cool.
Natalie, are you familiar with some farms growing other crops in here other than brassica crops? John Paul talked about experimenting with winter squash. Or just think about those trade-offs and identifying the different crops that might work at those different times. Or you know folks that are growing things other than brassicas at different time frames?
I don't, but yeah, there's a lot of potential.
One question is about shorter tarping times for hot summer weather use. Any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you could do shorter times. I also think that you could do clear tarps for just a few days at a time. Solarizing can really cook things. So if it is the peak of summer, I would encourage trying clear tarps for just a few days.
Debbie, you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I was just hoping to ask it versus type it in. Be easier. Nice presentation. I was just curious if you have been dealing with any issues with, weather variability, unpredictability, kind of as we're seeing changes in when rainfall happens or dry periods are. Has this been impacting, or are you seeing any differences over the years that you've been doing this tarping work in the region you are, in terms of the length of time tarping and cover cropping may be most effective?
I would say that the big thing is we used to have more wet springs back when I was a kid. And now we end up sometimes with dry springs. And so in a wet spring, tarping is fantastic because it keeps the soil moisture kind of constant. And so it doesn't get saturated. It drains to field capacity, and then you pull the tarp off and it's ready to go. Now, if you have a dry spring and you don't have irrigation, cover crops can actually suck up that water, and you can have a very dry soil when you put the tarp on if you don't irrigate. And tarping is not as effective. It's not really effective at all for weed control. It will terminate the cover crop, but it won't provide you with a lot of additional weed control if the soil is dry. So I do think that's a risk. I would say don't tarp a dry soil. Either irrigate or look at the weather and try to work around it. But yeah, I don't know if that answers.
Thank you.
Natalie, one question is about allelopathy. Does the allelopathy of rye rear its ugly head at all?
For a cash crop, for a subsequent cash crop, I don't know. We only did transplants. So I mean, allelopathy of rye would be great for weed seeds, bad for, lettuce. And I've never direct seeded lettuce into it. But I also have a feeling that with a longer tarping period, I don't think the allelopathic compounds are active for very long. I can't say that for sure, but I think if you are cover cropping for a couple weeks, I would guess it would not be as intense. But I would caution against direct seeding very susceptible crops. We're still in like a transplant or very, very hardy seeds like beans.
That's the next stage of novelty, I guess, right? Is to
Yeah.
direct seeded crops. Thanks, Natalie. I do want to.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.